So hardware inventory, what is it? It's discovering, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. What servers, what laptops, what desktops do we have in our environment? And you should have like a inventory, a catalog, a database that tracks each and every piece of equipment that's coming in and out. And organizations do this in different ways. Very, very important to know what hardware you have and what's on your network, what's in your enterprise. When organizations don't know this, it's really, really hard to protect things you don't know what's in your environment. Software inventory, much more difficult to do because an organization can have literally thousands of pieces of software. You can have hundreds of software just on one system. You can have a bunch of software. So identifying the software in your inventory, in your environment, is super important. Network communication, mapping the network communication is very, very important. Well, how do you do this? You do this with scanning, continuously monitoring, knowing what systems are actually, what IP addresses are attached to which systems. Network communication mapping is where this comes in. Supplier services, knowing who are your suppliers, identifying them and assessing them, monitoring them on a regular basis. This gets into supply chain resilience and things like that. Asset prioritization. Not everything is equal in your in your environment. Example might be you have peripheral systems, you have monitors, maybe you have some laptops, but you also have servers, and these servers are central to your the business and mission functions that you have in your environment. So you have a priority of assets. Like the most important are going to be, of course, the servers with critical information on them. The second might be some laptops that are absolutely mission essential for people to actually access that information. So you have different priorities of those assets as you're identifying them. Data inventory is, like we said before, classifying the information, identifying, tagging the information, knowing what data goes with what mission essential functions, and then protecting them accordingly. Asset lifecycle is super important. That means from the time that you have the data, from the time that the data is created to the time that you remove it, you're keeping track of it. From acquisition to decommissioning, from all of your assets, not just the data, but the actual hardware, the software. It has a life cycle that you're tracking on a regular basis. Risk assessment. So you can't do risk assessments without having a proper identification of vulnerabilities. You have to identify vulnerabilities, analyze threats, and then figure out the impact. If we do get hit, if our system gets hit, what is the impact to our organization? And you can't do any of that unless you can identify the vulnerabilities in your environment and identify the threats to your environment. So what goes into identification of vulnerabilities? This is vulnerability management in a nutshell. You're going to do scanning. Scanning is a huge part of identify. It'll just come up over and over again because it's one of the best tools that you can use to identify what's in your network. And then it's not enough to scan it because you get false positives, you get a bunch of junk data. So analysis is super important. Analyzing how this report, how the data is, how you can identify what's in your environment by looking at the actual scan and then prioritizing it based on your analysis. Another huge part of an organization, especially if you have very important information or if you're attacked on a regular basis, organizations like the Department of Defense, federal organizations, intel organizations, not just them though, major players in the market, like any market, if it's healthcare, if it's manufacturing, cyber threat intelligence has become more and more important. So what is it? It's at the last job I was in, we had a really good cyber threat intelligence process. And we used a tool that would go out and scour the net for any instances of our client's name. So Walmart, for example, if you saw Walmart's brand or any of the brands that they have out there that was on the dark web, you would go ahead and look at that. You take a look at it, we'd had a tool that would extract the data of what was being said on the dark web. And on the dark web, you would see things like they steal a bunch of credentials and then they would sell it, right? Some of it's not real, some of it's real. And then you have things like typo squatting, where people would take, instead of spelling out the name Walmart.com, they would use Walmart with 2 M's or Walmart with 2 T's.com. And they would sit on that name and then make a site that looks like Walmart and then hope that people would sign into it. So those are some of the things you would do for cyber threat intelligence. You'd analyze that data and then you'd take action. So that's also a part of threat identification. So you've got to identify internal threats and external threats. Internal threats are disgruntled employees. It could be a supplier. It could be somebody that you let go that who has insider information. So it's important to have processes that make sure that that you change passwords on a regular basis, or you get rid of accounts that old employees had. So there's internal threats and then there's external threats. Impact assessment is another huge part of identify, where you're identifying not only what's the primary assets that you have, prioritizing them, but what is the impact if we get hit. What is the impact to our organization? And that all comes back to identifying what are your assets, what are the most important things to your organization, and how can we protect them properly.